Hey everyone, today's show is episode 47, which will explore the different kinds of temperate forests across the world, as well as the unique biomes that surround the Mediterranean Sea. If you've been listening to this playlist on biomes, you'll have heard that desert biomes typically exist around 30 degrees latitude north and south of the equator, and that boreal forests and tundra typically exist between 50 and 70 degrees latitude in the far north. The temperate forests exist between these two biome extremes, but it's not so simple to just say that, deserts are 30 degrees, boreal forest is at 50 degrees, and temperate forests are at 40 degrees. It's not that clear cut. There are many different kinds of temperate forest, depending on the specific geography and climate variables of particular regions. You have to take into account things like the local humidity, the local temperature, and the seasonal climates, the soil quality, the available nutrients, the precipitation, and many other factors, creating a mosaic of temperate forests across the surface of the planet. These types of forest are the temperate conifer forests, the temperate mixed forests with both broadleaf and conifer trees, the temperate deciduous forests, and most humid of them all, the temperate rainforests. I should point out that these are not mutually exclusive types of forest. In fact, there's quite a lot of overlap between them. It's entirely valid to say that the mixed forests are just huge regions of overlap between conifer forests and deciduous forests. And despite the dry, cold, boreal forests being composed mostly of conifers, the warmest, wettest temperate forests are also composed of conifers, like the huge conifer forests in the northwestern and southeastern corners of North America. Because I talked about boreal forests and all of their conifers in the previous episode, I'll start today with the temperate conifer forests, so as to make these episodes a little more streamlined and continuous. This trend will continue into the final episode, because I'll still be moving further south, into the warmer, wetter, tropical rainforests and the jungles that cover the equatorial regions of the world's terrestrial surface. Alright, so let me start today's episode with the temperate conifer forests. These are relatively simple forests, which can be understood to have two primary layers, and you'll notice as I go through this and the next episode that much like the oceans, forests can also be understood in terms of layers, where each layer of the forest has different ecological variables and provides different ecological services, and is home to a different group of animals. Where some forests have the canopy, or even an upper and lower canopy, then a brush level and a ground level, the temperate conifer forests just have an understory and an overstory. The overstory includes primarily the branches and the trunks of the trees, which form this relatively thick layer that's topped with a canopy. This part of the conifer forests is typically inhabited by tree-dwelling species, like squirrels and bats, nesting species of birds, and however many hundreds of insects that live on or in the trees. The raw density of the overstory, especially where trees are closely packed together and their brushy conifer branches are all overlapping and intertwined, it creates this dense three-dimensional matrix that smaller creatures can live in, raise their young in, and hide from predators in. The understory is the relatively thin carpet of herbaceous plants that hug the ground, which includes grasses, mosses, liverworts, hornworts, and various shrubs and bushes, including berry plants like blueberry, cranberry, raspberry, and strawberry. I guess I should have mentioned this in the previous episode, but right now is the next best opportunity to talk about how conifer forests, both temperate and boreal, depend heavily on wildfires. Seasonal aridity makes some of these forests ripe for forest fires, and the regularity of these fires, called fire regimes or fire rotations, has actually influenced the evolution of the trees and the other plants that live here. These rotational fire cycles can take place over tens, if not hundreds of years, as vegetation grows in and fills up a geographic region, and then will eventually get washed out by fire when it becomes too dense and too dry. The fire destroys everything and litters the ground with ash, which actually creates a really fertile growing environment for the new plants that will emerge once the smoke clears. In ecological terms, this is an advanced successional community being destroyed, with its process of succession having been effectively reset by the forest fire. This has shaped many species of boreal and temperate conifer, like aspen, lodgepole pine, and black spruce, to be able to rapidly expand across an emptied landscape, and to almost virulently respread themselves. These cyclical fires serve several really important purposes. First, by resetting the community, they prevent a decline in biodiversity. And now this might seem a little counterintuitive because the fire destroys everything. But without fires, the longest-lived trees would simply outlive and eventually replace all of the other trees. But because fires come in and clean house, all of the shorter-lived but more rapidly growing trees have a better chance of sticking around. Second, many of these trees are actually only able to reproduce after they've been exposed to fire. They don't produce or release their seeds or go into a reproductive state or what have you, depending on the species, until they've been exposed to a heat threshold that only a forest fire can provide. This heat signal tells the plant that a forest fire has come by and cleared out the underbrush, which means the tree can enjoy little to no competition for water in its immediate area, and the local ground should be covered in nutrient-rich ash that can get washed into the soil by rain and picked up by the roots. Despite being primarily composed of conifers, the temperate conifer forests are spread across a huge geographic range with a wide variety of climates. But despite their impressive range, they only exist in the northern hemisphere. There are 0 temperate conifer forests anywhere in the southern hemisphere. The largest group of temperate conifer forests exists along the northwestern coast of North America, across northern California, Washington, and Oregon, up through western Canada, and across the Alaskan Panhandle and its southern coast. This conifer forest spreads over the Canadian portion of the Rocky Mountains, down across Idaho and Montana, Utah and Colorado, with forest reaching into nearby states like Nevada and New Mexico. Another huge patch of North American conifer forest exists on the other corner of the continent, in Louisiana, Georgia, and Florida. Temperate conifer forests are also spread out across Eurasia, although these forests are much patchier and more spread out. For example, thin strips of conifer forest exist along the northern coasts of several nations like Scotland and Norway, Japan, Turkey, and Iran, as well as a few thin bands of conifer forests that are scattered across the heart of Central Asia. In northern Scotland, there's a patch of conifer forest that exists where the mountainous land meets the cold North Sea. Here, on northeastern Scotland, the wind and the currents come together to make a somewhat chilly landscape that gets less precipitation than the highlands to the west and cooler temperatures than the rest of Great Britain to the south. The deciduous trees really can't handle this climate, so the only forest here in the northeastern pocket are the evergreen conifers, like the grand fir, the Scots pine, and various species of yew tree. Much like the boreal forests in cooler climates to the north, Scotland is carpeted in bryophytes, like mosses and hornworts. These are small, non-vascular plants with relatively durable bodies, able to withstand cold, snowy winters and hot, dry summers. The rest of Scotland, and for that matter the rest of Great Britain and Ireland, is covered in rolling pastures and grasslands and expanses of deciduous temperate forest. The animals in these forests are all typical to the medieval lore of the region, like brown bear, wolf, and elk, although all of the larger animals have unfortunately been hunted out. Smaller animals like squirrels, voles, martens, field mice, hares, and foxes still exist, as do a small handful of larger animals like various wildcats, horses, the Scottish red deer, the wild boar, Highland cattle, and of course, sheep. Lots and lots and lots of sheep. All the moss and grass makes Scotland prime real estate for the grazing cattle, be they sheep or cows, and their cultivation is a major part of Scottish agriculture. On the rockier islands to the north, the land is home to harbor seals and gray seals, who wash up to sunbathe on the rocks, and everywhere in the sky are the birds. Scotland has an absolutely huge array of birds, which exist not just here, but all across the British Isles and in much of Western Europe. These birds include the raptors, the apex predators of the skies, like the peregrine falcon and the golden eagle, as well as various species of hawk and owl. It includes scavengers like the crows, and vagrant birds flying in from the European mainland, like warblers and sparrows. Seabirds and waterfowl dominate the Scottish coastline, with its numerous rocky islands and shallow coastal lakes that are rich with Atlantic fish. Birds like the northern gannet, the Atlantic puffin, and the black-backed gull fly over the sea and dive to snatch fish out from near the surface of the water, or they wander along the shoreline, pecking at washed-up fish, at insects, at crabs, and at any tiny little morsel of meat that they might be interested in. They join the wading birds, like the various geese, ducks, and swans, as well as the tiny whimbrels with their long, thin beaks adapted for sifting through the mud of the marshes, bogs, and coastal wetlands in search of arthropods to eat. Now let's move our focus from Western Europe all the way across the Eurasian continent to Japan. In Japan, the geography and the position of the country creates a long gradient of climate zones and habitat types. Most of the country is covered in temperate forests of one flavor or another, designated by the particular overlapping ranges of tree and animal species that live there. For example, the northwestern coast of Honshu and most of Hokkaido is temperate conifer forest, although much of Hokkaido could be called boreal forest, not temperate, and I talked about this in the previous episode. Some of the trees that are common here are pine trees like Siberian dwarf pine and the Japanese black and red pines. Whereas these can dwell in the colder, drier climates of northern Japan, conifer trees like the huge Japanese red cedars, or sugi pine trees, are only able to grow in warmer climates with moist soil. These sugi pines are endemic to Japan, and they're the tallest trees in the country, so it's no surprise that they're the national tree. But because of their superior building qualities, like size and strength, they've been shipped and cultivated all over the world. A patch of southwestern Hokkaido and much of the forests along northern Honshu are deciduous or mixed, and not just purely conifer forest. For example, evergreen oak trees are common in that patch of Hokkaido, and oaks and beech trees are common along the northern half of Honshu. In both Honshu and Hokkaido, all the temperate forests experience relatively long, cold winters, usually defined by a lot of snowfall. Because of this generally cooler climate in North Japan, the animals that live here have largely descended from migrating populations of species that live on the Asian mainland, from the cooler, drier climates of eastern Siberia, Korea, and northeastern China. This is especially true for birds, which can easily migrate and recreationally fly back and forth between the Japanese islands and the mainland. I want to talk about the animals in Japan's temperate forests, but before I go on about mixed forests for too long, I want to spend a minute talking about their ecological structure and their organization. These mixed forests have both conifers and deciduous trees, so they create dynamic habitats that share qualities from both ecosystems. The mixed forests have an overstory, an upper canopy composed of taller, older trees that reach hundreds of feet into the air. The understory is dwarfed by these tall trees, as the understory only reaches about 50 feet up. The understory typically has 3 distinct layers. Immediately below the canopy of the understory is the subcanopy, which is composed of smaller trees, younger trees, and larger bushy plants. Many of these plants are shade tolerant, because they're stuffed down below the upper canopy of the overstory, and they don't have first access to incoming sunlight. Many of the trees in this subcanopy are able to grow much taller, but they're constrained by the amount of light that they get, and thus the amount of photosynthesis that they can conduct. In situations like this, these plants will compete for open patches of canopy where light still breaks through and touches the ground. The trees play a game of musical chairs, except instead of chairs, they're trying to grasp at sunlight, And instead of being a fun parlor game played over the course of a few minutes, these trees compete in a life or death struggle that's drawn out over centuries, as trees grow, wither, and then collapse, and make openings in the canopy for other trees to grow and fill in their place. Below this sub-canopy is a layer of shrubs and bushes and low-growing woody plants. Many of these plants are not just shade-tolerant, but in fact they require shade, as direct sunlight is too much for them to handle. Instead of feeding them and helping them grow big and large, direct sunlight actually burns them and makes them overheat and die. Functionally, this shrub layer aids the trees in mechanically holding the soil together and blocking the wind, which are two factors that go a long way to stabilize their habitat, to protect the habitat from erosion. These plants can do this because they have roots that are large enough and strong enough to do this, whereas the grasses and the mosses of the ground layer, or the herbaceous layer, do not. The herbaceous layer is the lowest layer, existing at ground level, and it's composed entirely of soft-bodied organisms like fungus, which love the moist darkness, and many other kinds of herbaceous plants, which include everything from grasses and mosses to geophytes, therophytes, and hemicryptophytes. These small, fuzzy plants create a literal green carpet that runs along the soil surface, feeding on the detritus of fallen trees in a way that reminds me a little bit of a whale fall. The trees are these huge, dense pieces of biomass, and when they fall and rot, they become food for decomposers like insects and fungus, and their physical structure becomes a home for mosses, insects, and rodents. Okay, so back to the Japanese forests. The terrestrial animals in these temperate forests are typical, like foxes, deer, and bears. But Japan also possesses an endemic primate species that thrives in their temperate climates, and that's pretty unusual for a primate. These larger animals engage in your typical food web interactions, based on the behavior and the diet of each species in question. Your foxes and other small, solitary carnivorans will prowl the underbrush, sniffing out large rodents, hares, and other small forest creatures that can be safely captured, killed, and consumed. The deer and other browsing animals will trim the lower foliage of the trees and the tips of the branches of bushes, while staying alert for signs of their predators. The wolf and the human are its most dangerous threats, but when bears can't fill their bellies on berries and fish from the river, they might scavenge a corpse or chase down an herbivore. As the animals, large and small alike, move past the plants, they get seeds stuck in their fur. Seeds that have evolved spikes or hooks to snap like Velcro into the fur of a passing mammal. Some seeds have evolved to exude a sticky resin or a sap of some kind, which will easily stick to and then get all tangled up in an animal's hair or an animal's fur. The purpose behind these evolutionary adaptations is to transport seeds across geographic space so that they can potentially be dropped off on some fertile ground. Here, the seed will germinate, create a new individual, and will maybe even spread out the territorial range of the species. Flowering plants and the growth of fruits serves the same purpose. The flower, like the Japanese cherry blossom, has a shape and a color and a fragrant odor that is pleasant and attractive to a particular species of pollinating insect. The insect inadvertently carries pollen from flower to flower, plant to plant, and this helps the plants reproduce. Similarly, fruits are swollen, sugary organs that encase or carry the plant's seeds. Animals, attracted by the tasty sugar, will eat the fruits, inadvertently consume the seeds, and then poop them out at some point in the future, at some other geographic location. And the seed, being deposited in this nutritious little lump of feces, will have a small boost as it tries to germinate and get started in this new alien environment. So far, I've explored conifer forests and mixed forests, so that takes us to the other end of the spectrum, where the only thing left is the pure deciduous forests, with their broad-leafed trees. Unlike conifers, these trees with their broad leaves are not evergreens. Every fall season, their leaves turn a stunning shade of brown as they die off, like an amber, a fiery orange, or a deep red. But they all turn to brown as the winter comes, and the cold wind cuts the last shriveled dry leaves off their branches. During the winter months, these trees look dead and barren, with their dry, empty branches reaching up like bony skeleton hands against the sky. But inherent to this season of dormancy is a season of growth, and when the winter ends and the spring thaw comes, these trees and plants will come out of their dormancy into full bloom. New, healthy green leaves emerge from pale green sprouts, and in the course of a few weeks, the world transforms from a pale, empty, brownish gray to a greenish gray to the all-out verdant green of a lush summer forest. This blooming period sees an explosion in ecological activity, because it's not just the trees and the flowering plants that emerge from dormancy. Insects wake up and come out of their burrows or their hives, or they fly up from the warmer southern lands where they spend the winter. These insects act as pollinators for many of the newly awakened plants, and they begin right away with the work of spreading pollen and helping the plants reproduce. With the arrival of the insects comes the reawakening of the amphibians, who come out of hiding to feed once more on all of the insects, either their eggs in the swamp water, the insects flying around in the air, or the bugs that are crawling around on a plant. As far as forest layers go, the deciduous forests have the same 4 major layers as mixed forests, as they can support a larger subcanopy biomass. The paper-thin leaves of a broadleafed forest can be rustled by the wind, which allows sunlight to break through to the ground in bursts and sputters, and this extra little bit of sunlight provides enough energy to support more grasses, more shrubs, more small trees, and all sorts of subcanopy plants. Contrast this to a conifer forest, where the tree branches are thick with needles, to the point of blocking out pretty much all light from reaching the ground. Across the world, there are some small strips and patches of deciduous forest that exist along the southern ridges of the Himalayas, along the southern tip of the Andes Mountains, and the southeastern shores of Australia and much of New Zealand. But besides this, there are 3 huge expanses in the world of relatively pure deciduous forest. One of the 3 largest collective deciduous forests in the world exists across the southeastern quarter of North America, which means that pretty much every state in the eastern third of the US is covered in this deciduous forest. The second massive expanse of deciduous forest is in Eastern Asia, filling in the northern half of the eastern Chinese lowlands and covering both North and South Korea, and reaching north of them both into the southern expanses of Siberia. The third expanse is in Europe, where temperate deciduous forest covers pretty much all of Great Britain, the northern coasts of Spain, and virtually all of Eastern and Western Europe. This mass of deciduous forests extends deep into Russia, enveloping Moscow and reaching as far inland as the Ukraine. It reaches down across the Balkans, into Macedonia and northern Greece. And this deciduous forest even creeps along the southern border of the Black Sea into Turkey, where it then spreads throughout the Mesopotamian valley into western Iran. In the countries of Turkey and Iran, thin strips of conifer forest run along the southern coasts of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, respectively. In Turkey, this conifer-covered coastline runs along the rugged and mountainous landscape of the eastern Anatolian Plateau. Moist air coming southeast over the Black Sea crashes against these cliffs and mountainsides. The clouds break apart and spill their rain over the landscape, and this creates enough humidity to support a temperate rainforest ecology. The whole southeastern corner of the Black Sea is bordered by temperate rainforest, composed of dense conifer forest to the south and deciduous forest to the east. So, by this point in the series, I've mentioned a rainforest quite a few times. But what exactly is it that makes a temperate forest a rainforest? Because not all temperate forests are rainforests, so what's the determining variable here? If the name gave it away, and you guessed rain, you're right. The most widely used definition puts a threshold of 140 centimeters of rainfall a year, with an average temperature between 4 and 12 degrees Celsius. For Americans, that's about 55 inches of rain and an average temperature between 39 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit. So, a lot of rain, but pretty cool temperatures. It's not super hot. But if you go to Australia, their definition of a temperate rainforest is one which is mostly composed of tree species that don't require fire to regenerate or to regrow. This is because the temperate rainforests are simply too humid for a forest fire to start, so the life here would have to adapt to a habitat that does not have the cleansing or stimulating effects of a seasonal forest fire. These humid rainforest areas are almost always coastal, or near a body of water so as to receive humid air from favorable winds. Temperate rainforests exist along the Pacific coast of North America, along Washington, Canada, and Alaska. They exist along the southwestern coasts of Norway and Ireland, the northern coast of Spain, and a small little bit of temperate rainforest even exists in the Balkans. There are temperate rainforests on all the coastal lands surrounding the Sea of Japan, including the Korean Peninsula, the southeasternmost corner of Russia, and of course, Japan itself. But temperate rainforest also exists in a wide patch right down the middle of Southeast Asia. This forest isn't touching any coastline, but it does sit directly north of the tropical jungles and rainforests of Myanmar, Cambodia, and Thailand. So a lot of the residual moisture that doesn't get sucked up by these rainforests gets deposited over these temperate rainforests a little farther north. The last major strips of temperate rainforest exist on the most southern third of South America, hugging the landscape between the coast and the tail of the Andes Mountains, as well as in Tasmania and New Zealand. Just like the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea keeps its southern coastline relatively humid as well, which allows conifer forest and temperate mixed forests to exist along the northern edges of Iran. The entire western reach of Iran is covered in temperate deciduous forest, although this is much drier due to the xeric climates and the widespread desert that characterizes most of the country. Despite its proximity to the Persian Gulf, western Iran has low humidity because of its mountainous and high-altitude landscape. Now, Iran is a really interesting country, because as far as climates go, Iran has almost everything. In the northern regions of the country, where it's mountainous and cold, the conifer forests are home to lynx and wolves and foxes, and other animals that are typically associated with northern biomes. Iran also has horses, wild pigs, goats, cows, and jackals, which are all associated with more temperate climates. It also has gazelles, camels, and cheetahs, which are animals associated with hot, dry climates like deserts and savanna. In the northwest of Iran, it has a more Mediterranean climate, as does much of southern Turkey, and all the rest of the land that actually literally borders the Mediterranean Sea. Now, I've mentioned the Mediterranean biome, but it's one of the more specific biomes that many people might not fully understand. As a recognized climate zone, the Mediterranean exists across much of Italy, Greece, western Turkey, south and southwestern Spain, and the northern coasts of Morocco and Algeria. Small patches of Mediterranean climate also dot the southern hemisphere, appearing in scattered patches in Chile, Bolivia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, central Ethiopia, western Australia, and California. All of these areas are characterized by the relatively warm and rainy winters and the hot, dry summers of the Mediterranean. It's a very warm climate, certainly, and very stable, but it's also relatively dry, with almost no rainfall in the summer and only a little in the winter. During the winter, melting snow from higher latitudes can cause flooding in regions with a Mediterranean climate, making their winters soggy and wet. During the summer, it gets dry enough that wildfires can become a concern, and prolonged periods of dryness can lead to droughts. In this way, the plant life in the Mediterranean climates has to be pretty hardy and sturdy due to these extremes, and it has to be resistant to a wide variety of potential abiotic challenges. As life tends to be stubborn, and evolution typically finds a way for life to survive and adapt to even the most challenging conditions, the life that lives in these Mediterranean habitats is resistant to flooding, resistant to droughts, and resistant to fires. And just like the plants in a conifer forest, they can rebound and regrow really quickly after a fire comes through and burns down all the underbrush. The Mediterranean biomes are dominated by the underbrush, by all the various bushes and shrubs that compose scrubland. These aren't quite forests, but more like an extensive community of shrubs, bushes, and grasses of all manner of shapes and sizes. In the south of France, the Mediterranean climate hosts a layer of scrubland called garrigue, which includes grasses like sedges, rushes, and bunchgrass, shrubs like rosemary, sage, and lavender, fruit like olives and figs, trees like sycamore, oak, and cypress, as well as the grapes that are cultivated and processed into the world-famous Mediterranean wine. The holm oak tree is more common in the maquis, which is another French word for a kind of really dense and overgrown garrigue. The maquis exists all along the Mediterranean coastline, going by other names in other countries like the macchia in Italy, batha in Israel, and fragana in Greece. This kind of dense Mediterranean vegetation also exists in the New World, where it's called chaparral in California and the matorral in Chile. All of these Mediterranean climate regions, these Mediterranean biomes, have relatively high biodiversity, more so than the boreal forests and even many temperate conifer forests, and even more than many temperate mixed forests. However, I'll be exploring these areas in the next episode, which will round out this series on biomes by exploring the jungles and tropical rainforests of the world. If you like this episode, then hit the like button, and if you like all my content, then subscribe so you can see all my new stuff right when I post it. And as always, thanks for listening.